Hello, everyone. Oh, hair's a little messy. That's all right. If I haven't worried, as it is, too much about looking sloppy, at this point, it's too late now. You already think of me as a rumpled professor. That said, welcome again. Here we are at the ninth, 10th, 11th video. Not entirely sure at this point, but we are here to talk about a little African American history from the early days. I see no one has clicked on, so I'll wait a couple seconds. And while I wait for the folks to click on, who usually have been here before, so they don't need to hear my disclaimer. Not disclaimer. My introduction. It's not a disclaimer. My introduction. Hello, Jay. I see one of my first has arrived. But I will get the important details out of the way. I say this every week, so those of you who've been here from the beginning, you've heard it over and over and over again, so please forgive me for being repetitive, but it bears repetition, in my humble opinion. No, cat. And what bears repetition is that there is a lot of misinformation circulating out in the world, and although we should not simply attack a message because of the messenger, we should always be aware of who the messenger is, where they come from, and from where they get any kind of authority on the topics in which they speak. Because there is so much misinformation circulating in the world, we need to make sure that people who are trying to tell us things or make assertions about reality actually have ideas what they're talking about. For example, I would take the word of a respected by his or her colleague scientist over a politician on matters of science any day now. So, with that said, I'm going to tell you who I am because it's worthwhile to know who I am bringing these talks to you. And so, again, Joseph Solar, it's my name. I'm a PhD in urban education from Temple University, and I received my undergraduate degrees in history and African American studies from Harvard University. And so I've focused a lot of my work and issues on the intersections of race and public policy, specifically educational policy for my dissertation, but other issues as well. Sorry, my cat is sneezing. So anyway, that is what brings me to this, because as a policy issue, it is clear that a lot of people are unaware of the history and the realities that have shaped Black life in America, which has motivated to a great degree the Black Lives Matter movement and protest against police brutality and similar issues. And so I want to bring you pieces of Black history as best as I can so that we can be better educated on reality and facts. So as we try to figure out how to move our country forward and become a better country, or to appeal, as Lincoln said in early 65, to the better angels of our nature, we can do so from a shared understanding of what reality is and has been for a significant portion of our population. It is also worthwhile understanding the contributions of African Americans to the broader American society, because such contributions have often been absent from the general discourse and inadequately covered when they are there. One of the jokes, and I don't mean it as a funny joke, but as a kind of wry observation that makes a person think, is that when I assign papers in my classes on African American history, the papers are biographical. They are meant to do the biography of an important person, and I specifically tell my students they're not allowed to do Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, or Nat Turner, because those are the three people that have entered the canon, and we are familiar with them to some degree or another, and that I want people to expand the canon, CANON, to include more voices and more people. And so today I'm going to do a little bit about that and talk about some important phenomena. And so let's get underway. 5-minute introduction covered. I see 7 of you here, so let's get moving. I'm talking about telling one's own story and what we call the slave narratives in American history. And so it's worth kind of covering, kind of broadly speaking, where it comes from, why it comes from, and that before we then dig into some of the more particulars of it. So the first famously important, significant slave narrative was the life and travels of Olaudah Equiano, who was an African man, Igbo by his own telling, who was kidnapped in Africa, sold into slavery, and whose life reads like quite an adventure story, traveling, sailing, being part of British expeditions, and ultimately purchasing his freedom. His story is published in the latter half of the 18th century, the 1790s. I have the date here. Let me look it up. Gustavus Vasa is how it also went. Yes. He dies in 1797. He publishes his story in the 1787, I believe. It was published as in Britain at first, among the British, because, wow, they had an active abolitionist movement. And one of the things I'm going to talk about next week is the first wave, we'll call it the first wave abolitionist movement in America, which is significant because it is relatively unknown because we focus on what ultimately was the more successful abolitionist movement with those names, some of whom we'll talk about today. So anyway, Gustavus Vasa, as he was named, but Olaudah Equiano, as he names himself, publishes this slave narrative, and it becomes sort of a template for slave narratives, broadly speaking. But that said, we don't enter into the era of the so-called slave narrative until about the 1830s. And it coincides with the second wave abolitionist movement in the United States. And the kind of generating event of this was Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner's Rebellion leads to widespread repression of black communities, free and enslaved, throughout the South, and also in the North. And I think that's what's also very important to understand is Nat Turner's Rebellion occurs in 1831, and through that decade, what we see is voting rights and civil rights for free African Americans in the North are taken away as the United States makes this turn towards greater slavery and greater repression to maintain the institution of slavery, both North and South. And one reality that is often understated is that though states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey had passed what they called gradual emancipation laws, they were gradual. And so even though Connecticut, Pennsylvania are free states, theoretically, in the 1830s, there are still people in Connecticut, in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, who are enslaved and who live out their lives enslaved because slavery was gradually going away. And so the 1830s is this kind of turning point. It also is the foundation of that second wave abolition movement. All the big wigs, William Lloyd Garrison, Richard Allen, James Forten, Paul Cuffey, Angelina Grimke, Theodore Weld, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. I mean, just explosion. And it enters into American discourse in a time where several forces are at work. One is that in southern states, when I talk about increasing repression, we literally see laws that make it illegal for enslaved African Americans to be literate, and that make it illegal to teach enslaved African Americans to read, And these laws are horrifying in their punishments. So, African Americans who are literate and who are teaching other enslaved African Americans to read can be put to death for the crime of teaching literacy. Sit and germinate on that for a minute. That to teach an enslaved African American person to read is punishable by death if the person doing the teaching is himself or herself enslaved. Similarly, the enslaver class, these masters, who made arguments about slavery centered on their sacred holy property rights. And these so-called sacred holy property rights said, among other things, that the federal government shouldn't be too powerful because we don't want the federal government to outlaw slavery and take away our property, which of course they meant human beings. And so they believed in sacred property rights, especially with regards to owning human beings. Well, that belief in sacred property rights had limits because under South Carolina law and other southern areas, if the enslaver was teaching his or her property, his enslaved people, how to read, that property would be seized and sold off at auction. So again, it kind of emphasizes and demonstrates the kind of hypocrisy of this enslaver class, that they scream and stomp their feet all over Congress about their sacred property rights, but then they themselves pass laws which interfere with those property rights for themselves. So, in other words, the institution of slavery is more important to them than was property rights. So property rights is only sacred so long as it protects slavery. As soon as it doesn't, well, then they will bend the rules however they need to. The irony, of course, is they passed these laws in the 1830s restricting literacy and education and imposing these harsh penalties, violation of life and property, right? Depending on who the violator was. But for decades leading up to this point, one of the justifications in sort of this nascent racism was that African people were barbarians. They were an uncultivated, backwards, uncivilized people who were incapable of the higher refinements of civilization, including literacy. And so again, hypocrisy. Because for years they're saying, these people can't read. They're not civilized. They're incapable of civilized things. And yet, by the 1830s, they're saying they're incapable of these things, so we're going to make it illegal and impose really harsh penalties upon them for these things that they can't do anyway, that they're incapable of doing. So, obviously, there's a lot of what we call cognitive dissonance, the inability to connect facts and realities to each other, right? So, the 1830s, we see the emergence of several forces. It's quite a decade, frankly, under Andrew Jackson there, in that we see harsh laws against literacy. We see a new wave of abolition, an abolitionist movement, but coincidentally, perhaps coincidentally, we also see emerging in New England and in Ohio and in New York and Pennsylvania growing public education. And this growing public education is leading to a general increase in literacy among the masses of American citizens. And so more and more people are learning how to read, while more and more people are gaining access to schools in the North. But in the South, there is very little movement on public schooling. North Carolina has a little bit. And there are laws specifically outlawing literacy. So what does all this have to do with the slave narrative? Well, the slave narrative has several important functions. One publishing books is a recognition that there is an audience for books, that there are people who are going to read these stories and these accounts, and by doing so, be moved. And so last week I shared the link to the University of North Carolina Documenting the American South project, and you can see on that website, I'll share the link again today for first timers, although it wasn't working this morning, but anyway, that there's just slews and slews of these narratives that are written, but some justify slavery and romanticize it and some don't. I'm using Henry Louis Gates's Classic Slave Narratives introduction for a little facts here. So, for example, 1845, so 15 years later, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what these numbers mean and more about the narrative themselves. Frederick Douglass writes his autobiography, and it sold 5,000 copies in the first 4 months. And then in the next 2 years, it sold 11,000 more. In Britain, they published 9 editions of that book, and he ended up in Britain seeking refuge from American oppression. That's a whole nother story. By 1860, 30,000 copies of Frederick Douglass's autobiography had been sold. And understand that that doesn't mean 30,000 copies were read. It could have been far more people reading it. But we can definitely argue, given the price of books back then, that books that were purchased were books that were read. They didn't just sit on shelves unread. Solomon Northup. He's the man who wrote 12 Years a Slave, about his true story of being kidnapped into slavery as a free man and living there and then gaining his freedom. Sold 27,000 copies in its first 2 years. Moses Roper, his book went through 10 editions. William Wells Brown, in the first year, went through 4 editions. Josiah Henson sold 5,000 before it had even been published. So thousands of people are reading these narratives. And I mentioned the incidents in the life of a slave girl whose character, Linda Brent, was actually, I forgot, I don't know if it was UJ or Cassandra, who reminded me that it was Harriet Jacobs. I always get stuck on the Linda Brent thing, but goes through thousands of editions as well. And so what was this slave narrative? Well, taken as a whole, the slave narrative story is a subgenre of American literature. What is notable and important is that by the 1820s, the United States was just developing its own literary styles and genres connected to our experience in this country, on this frontier, in this new world, with the promise of what the United States offered. And so there are very much these themes that occur in American literature that are modifications of European themes generally, but that nonetheless matter. The Olaudah Equiano book that I mentioned earlier from the 1790s was very much a work of British adventure literature. He is a person and he's living his life and he gets kidnapped and he gets dragged off into captivity and he then lives an enslaved life, but as an enslaved person, he's sailing everywhere. He's part of expeditions. He fights in the French and Indian War. Cassandra, thank you. I mean, he's on and on and on everywhere. And in the context of these adventures, he develops this rich sense and appreciation of the broader and wider world. He becomes a better educated person. He eventually earns his freedom and begins to speak out against slavery, including addressing the British Parliament on the issue. So, American literature was developing its own traditions, and slave narratives will fit within these traditions. One of the great novelists of this 1820s and 1830s time is James Fenimore Cooper. And James Fenimore Cooper writes very much about this kind of frontier adventure life, living on the frontier and fighting bears and Native Americans and that type of thing. Cooper, of course, though, is not as aggressively colonialist in that he has characters. I mean, Last of the Mohicans is about sympathetic Native American characters who adopt a white European child and mixed people. And there's lots of risky stuff in Cooper. But why am I introducing this? Because there is just multiple authors. There are multiple authors. There are multiple authors who write captivity narratives. And these captivity narratives are narratives about Europeans being kidnapped into Native American tribes and forced to become part of the family and then earn their freedom. You see where I'm going with this, right? Because when African Americans begin to publish their slave narratives, they are captivity narratives. They are the African and African American version of the slave narrative. They are flipping the traditional script, because in the traditional American literary captivity narrative, it is the Europeans who are the victims of these rapacious, savage natives who kidnap them and bring them into the jungle. Again, James Fenimore Cooper, part of why he's a great novelist is he's not just blandly racist against Native people, and he provides sympathy and nuance and whatever. But what African American slave narratives do is they turn the white Europeans enslavers into the savage captives or capturers of innocent people. And so individuals who would have been reading these captivity novels and would have been familiar with stories of innocent native, or excuse me, innocent English women kidnapped who go native and start becoming native and then get their freedom and reunite with their family and whatever, etc. Well, now this would have been a familiar format, a familiar literary structure to them, the captivity. Except now they are looking at people who are not themselves, because by and large, these slave narratives were aimed at the white European and European descended audiences. And so they would recognize the stories of people who are literally just going about their own business when enslavers come charging out of the woods and grab everybody and pack them on boats and drag them off into slavery. This would have been exactly a scene in one of these native captivity novels. And so if Europeans had become accustomed to feeling sympathy and empathy for the whites who'd been kidnapped by these so-called savage natives, this slave narrative would have actually been able to kind of hit that spot that already existed within them of like, I feel bad for people who were kidnapped. Aha! So now they could look at this and say, oh, these things that we fear being done to us, we, our people like us anyway, are doing this to others. And by doing so, they could hopefully create, engender, plant a seed of kindness and sympathy in the mind of the reader by illustrating the parallels. Yes, Cassandra. Alauda Equiano was actually before Leatherstocking Tales by Fenimore Cooper, but those are the ones I'm talking about in terms of captivity novels. But there's also one, Mary Rowlandson, which is kind of like the epitome. A lot of them come and go and are just useless trash, frankly. I've taught early American literature, and early American literature is not literature, it's just garbage. But that said, moving forward into this kind of genre, or this use of an existing genre and turning it into social and political commentary is very important. But it has more purposes than just kind of a parallel structure that might enable white Americans to find sympathy or even empathy with enslaved African Americans. It served that second purpose, because just as the captivity novels, not Cooper, again, he was sympathetic, but a lot of the garbage captivity novels portrayed Native people in horrendous, kind of savage ways. Well, part of the growing mythology, of course, was that African Americans were savage and inferior and incapable. And if that was the case, then simply being able to put together and write and provide an account, a written account of one's own experience, is, on the straight surface of it, evidence that the beliefs being perpetrated in society of these ignorant barbarians is untrue. Because these people whom we consider barbarians, whom we capture, not only experience situations similar to what we complain about happening to us, but they are equally capable as we are of coming out of that story, being redeemed from slavery, being redeemed from captivity, and once redeemed, being able to tell their story in powerful and forceful words with the nuance and intelligence that we expect of civilized and enlightened people. These captivity novels, that's what they are. These slave narratives tend to follow the same arc, thus creating, in essence, a genre of American literature. If you read these novels, you will see that they all start with that moment where the individual either is enslaved, in the case of those who are literally just captured and brought over, like Olalo Equiano, and or the moment, because again, remember that in the United States, a child could be born, and because of the unique situation of America, be born a slave. But of course, infants don't understand necessarily the reality of the world. And so a lot of these stories, a lot of these slave narratives speak of that moment when, as a child, the person, whoever the person is the author was, realized that he or she was enslaved, that he or she would live a life as a captive, that he or she was born in captivity. The case of Frederick Douglass is particularly traumatic because he was born the son of a white father who had likely raped his mother, and his mother was, by some accounts, I still have to read David Blight's kind of brand new 800-page biography of Douglass, but by some accounts it seems like she was an alcoholic, and so Douglass was raised by his grandmother, and so he grew up living with his grandmother and being a child until the age of 6. At the age of 6, his grandmother says, "Hey, Frederick, we're going to take a walk." And they take a long walk to a home he'd never been to on another plantation. And his grandmother says to him, "Oh, look, there's some other children your age. Go play with the kids." And while he's playing with the kids, his grandmother leaves, because what had happened was that his enslaver had sold him. And so his grandmother had been ordered to deliver him to his new owner slash enslaver. And she didn't tell him because she wanted to make sure she could get him there in safety's sake and whatever. And so when Douglass recognizes his grandmother's gone, he's in a strange place full of strangers. He does what any 6-year-old child would do. He cries and he screams and he's terrified and he's traumatized for life. And that's the turning point. That's the moment when 6-year-old Frederick Douglass recognized that he was enslaved. That is the moment, in essence, where, mentally speaking, he was now a captive, because now he was aware that he was a captive. And all of these slave narratives will have that moment. In the case of 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup, he's free. And so in his case, it is literally how he gets tricked and kidnapped and drugged. And he wakes up in a slave pen being sold, and he recognizes he's a captive. Olaudah Equiano is kidnapped from his Igbo village, and he is sold into slavery. And so all of these slave narratives have that moment. Then, of course, the rest of the novel, or there's other parts of it. The other parts of the novel will, of course, detail the violence, the abuse, the heartache, the trauma, the suffering, because, of course, the point is to appeal to the heart and the soul of the people. And very often, most of these novels have a very heavily kind of Christian moralist component, because a lot of abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison and the Grimkes, were Christians who believed in creating a conversion experience, converting the enslaver to the abolitionist, right? Similar to what Richard Allen had done, as I talked about a couple weeks ago with Stokely Sturgis, that conversion moment. So they detail abuses, violence, and just the horror of living in captivity as an enslaved person. And we have to, I think that language of captivity is important, because we talk about people being slaves. People aren't slaves. People are enslaved. People are made into captives, forced to work for the people who keep them captive, with the threat of violence hanging over their heads. And this is very much the goal of these slave narratives. The author is going to show who I am. I am a human being. I am a moral being. I am, particularly in later years, a Christian moral being. I am just like you, except for the circumstances that are being imposed upon me, against which I must struggle to overcome and redeem myself from captivity. And so there was always that piece of the novel where the narrator, the captive person, learns, educates himself or herself. In the cases where the individual is literate and able to write his or her own story, they will always tell the story of how it is they learned how to read, despite the fact that it was illegal, despite the fact that I wasn't supposed to, etc. And so how they overcame the oppression imposed upon them to learn how to read or to learn how to tell their own story. And then, of course, there will be the kind of adventure, harrowing tale of their escape and how they escaped and the near misses and how they, dodged the dogs or almost got caught but managed to get away. That escape narrative, adventure piece. And then, of course, their arrival in the North, their arrival in freedom, their first experiences of freedom, of breathing free air, of living a free life, of meeting free people who looked like them. Although in the case of Douglas, that was before freedom. So they tell all of those pieces in their redemption. And then, of course, by the end of the story, there is the kind of the exhortation to the reader, like, see, I am like you. Am I not a man? Right? As Douglas said. This is what was done to me, though I am like you. This was how hard and what I had to struggle to overcome and to redeem myself from the land of bondage, to become free. Why should we perpetuate this system that is so unchristian, that is so unjust on the highest ideals of this country that we call home? Why should we persist and perpetuate a system that denies human dignity? Because we are dignified people, just like you. And Douglas was very big on that. And so you have that transition, and then the way out. And every story follows the same pattern, the same arc of storytelling will go along this way. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier is the fact that not all African Americans who write slave narratives actually write them, because there are a great many people who escape who are illiterate because of the imposed and legally enforced illiteracy. And so we have these narratives that are dictated to white abolitionists who transcribe them and publish them. And this is where we begin to get into more of a tricky bit, because all of these narratives were fighting against a tide of pro-slavery, anti-black propaganda. And so a lot of individuals were skeptical that these narratives were authentic or genuine or written by that person. You know, like, he can't write it, he's a barbarian. It was written by a white agitator. Note I'm using the agitator word, which, if you have ever seen civil rights documentaries about the 60s, you'll hear a lot. And so very often these narratives have these cover pages that talk about, I'm going to hold up one of the editions of this, and this is Olaudah Equiano's 1814 edition, and it says right there, written by himself. And the idea, and there's an abolitionist medal there, the idea is, look, these narratives should all be true, but understand that there are some narratives that the person who wrote them literally was able to write them. My pleasure, Wayne. Thank you for checking in. I love having everyone come and learn some things and then hopefully be inspired to go read some more new cool stuff. So they would have these front dedications, which would have to testify. Because, of course, one of the things that the abolitionists wanted to do is they wanted to be believed. And the stories of the things that occurred in slavery were unbelievable to many people, particularly new immigrants coming to America who weren't familiar with American slavery, particularly to northern audiences who wanted, plausible deniability. And so you wanted to make sure that the narrative was as forthcoming as possible. And so a lot of these narratives by illiterate people, like Venture Smith's narrative, would say things like dictated to blank, and I swear this is true. They would have these attestations. We spoke to this person, we interviewed him, we interviewed her. We believe, based on being reputable members of the white community, lawyers, doctors, surgeons, politicians, that what this person is telling us is true. We could not shake him or her from the story, but since he or she could not write it, we wrote it down for him exactly as he intended it to be. Then those who were literate, marginally literate, like they knew how to read and write basically, but they weren't necessarily literary scholars. They would very often have their narratives edited by, again, white abolitionists who would try to kind of shape the narrative to the political agenda. And of course the question becomes like, well, is this why the narratives all follow that same narrative arc? Because kind of there was the agenda behind it and whatever. And maybe, but as we know from narrative after narrative, and even those published after the end of slavery, the stories and the conditions reported by people were pretty uniform in terms of abuse and exploitation and whatever. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who edited this edition of the classic slave narratives, he asserts that Douglass modeled his work after the narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, and that the trajectory and the adventure story bits was because Douglass had to have read it by the time he wrote his own. And he understood that it's not just enough to advocate against slavery. Yeah, Cassandra has a good point. The narrative, Cassandra's asking that the narrative would have to be approved by the oppressor. Is it a possibility the stories were edited? So, theoretically, the narratives were published by abolitionist printing presses, including ones that included African American abolitionists who were participating in free. So whether those individuals could be considered oppressors or not is definitely a debatable point of view. They were certainly abolitionists, which makes them more the friend of the enslaved than the enemy. But there is definitely the case that these would have been edited very often and disclosed that fact. And so that's why these attestations on the dictated tales that, like, yes, look, we know that it was really Lydia Maria Child who edited this and who wrote this down, but she didn't make this up. This is a true story dictated to her directly by so and so. And we know this because all these other people interviewed so and so and heard the same story. But abolitionists, of course, there's this reality too that you have to think that the abolitionists knew their audience and perhaps knew how to appeal to that audience, maybe. So it's a very tricky bit. But this is why Douglas, when Douglas publishes his in 1845, he is very assertive that his was written by himself because he recognizes that it's not enough simply, I'm looking for, see if I can find the cover of his. It is not enough, written by himself, Boston, 1845, published by the Anti-Slavery Office, right? So published by people who were on his side. It is not enough that he tells his story, but that he is well aware of his own genius. He knows that he has a mastery of the English language narrative form. He's read Equiano's story, which was also written by himself. And he knows that that written by himself adds an extra level of gravitas, of weight to his story. Because not only is it a captivity narrative, not only is it a philosophical kind of appeal for human equality and dignity based on the founding principles of the U.S. or whatever, but by the eloquence of its prose, by the way that Douglas was able to write it himself so beautifully, the document itself, the structure of the document itself, was evidence of natural human equality. And he is so keenly aware and so keenly aggressive, I guess would be the word, in pushing this notion that, like, look, slavery is wrong, but there are definitely those among the freedom advocates who don't actually believe in human equality. They just don't believe in slavery. And he says, I have to hit on both fronts. I need to show equality by the way that I write. And that I need to prove equality through telling this compelling redemption tale that mirrors and parallels the redemption stories and tales that others have been writing, and that, of course, are connected to an American subgenre. And Douglas's autobiography, Narrative of a Life of Slave, an autobiography is the magic word. And it is very powerful in that he is the great voice. And this is also part of the story and the situation, too, that kind of is balanced and why slave narratives were important. It was one thing for well-meaning white people to talk about the wrongs of slavery, right? They knew how to talk to other white people, etc. But it is always going to be more important and more authentic to hear the voices who lived the life within slavery themselves and directly, and who can speak from their eyewitness and firsthand accounts of what it is that they experienced. And to have someone like Douglas, who not only experienced it, but who was a genius level intellect, adds extra importance to this mission. And again, another, reality is that most of these individuals, most of these slave narratives are, they're okay. They tell horrible stories and whatnot, But ultimately, people who escape from slavery are simply people. So some of them are literary geniuses, and some of them are just the rest of us. No shame in being the rest of us. But when you read a Frederick Douglass, you recognize that there's this extra level of genius that some people have, and that we all wish we had, but that very few of us do. And that brings us to Harriet Jacobs and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was so dramatic, and the stories and details were so completely fit into this redemption captivity narrative format and structure and convenience that it wasn't until at least around 1980 that scholars came to the consensus that it was a true story. Like, the story was almost too perfect in terms of the romantic, sentimental novels of the time to have been a true story. But after sleuthing and sleuthing and sleuthing, a scholar, last name of Yellen, managed to fully confirm in a way that everybody was like, okay, finally, we know this is true. And a lot of people had wanted it to be true. A lot of people had believed it was true, but the kind of evidence wasn't there. And there are real reasons for this. Harriet Jacobs is much more explicit about issues of sexual exploitation than was considered polite. Right? And so when you think about kind of what she talks about, her master sitting her on her lap and whispering things in her ears and stuff like that, this is all highly charged, controversial material. And so she wrote under a pseudonym too, which also kind of added to the mystery, right? Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass was written by Frederick Douglass, but Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl is written by Harriet Jacobs and features a character called Linda Brent. But the material that Harriet Jacobs was discussing was material that, even though she was the victim of sexual abuse, think about the world and misogyny, would have made her scandalous, perhaps untouchable, right? In that horrible way where the woman victim, even if we know she's a victim, she somehow is unclean for having been a victim. And so when Harriet Jacob writes her story, it makes sense for her to use a pseudonym, because that way the moral stain in this puritanical American society for having been a child victim wouldn't fall upon her. And so that she could convey the shocking abuses and outrages to which she had been subjected, which were real. And this is something that gets to a point today when people talk about civility, just be civil, just be civil, just be civil. Very often, asking people to be civil is just an attempt to silence them from sharing the uncomfortable truths. And these narratives, even Douglas's narrative features a rape scene that he witnesses as a child, always had to kind of dance around it. Oh, and I saw the woman run in, and the guy chased her, and then something terrible happened. Boop, that's it. Implied rape. But never discussed, never described, never whatever, because it wasn't polite to discuss sex and sexuality in public. And what that means is women telling these stories. One, they had to self-censor part of the story of what had happened to them, and which happened to so many women. Well, happens to so many women, period. Hard stop. Whether they're enslaved or free or whatever, that is the world. But particularly as a feature of life and enslavement, sexual abuse. And so they could talk about outrages, quote, outrages. They could talk about things that happened, things that shouldn't be repeated, but they couldn't describe it. And Harriet Jacobs goes further along in describing these things than any woman author had beforehand. And it was her story. And so her story kind of brings together two different traditions. Harriet Jacobs is a captivity novel, but it's also a sort of redemption from being the fallen woman novel, which was another kind of sentimental trope about these fallen women who can redeem themselves and find God and become good, morally pure people. And so she actually kind of fuses together these women's genres and or the women's genre along with this captivity genre, more the adventure tales. And so it represents kind of a high watermark in the slave narrative genre. What is notable about this, and I always say this, and it's just so like, face plant, is that I read you those numbers of the thousands of these slave narratives that were being published and bought and read. Despite that, the novel, an actual novel, fictional novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, sells more copies than all of them put together, and no book sold more copies than Uncle Tom's Cabin than the Bible. So the only book that outsells Uncle Tom's Cabin is the Bible. So when push comes to shove, as much as these narratives provide this important literary witness to atrocity, abuse, captivity, enslavement, redemption, bold escapes, human equality, human dignity, etc., the most influential one was written by a white woman who was an abolitionist. She was an abolitionist. She worked in abolitionist circles. Her family were abolitionists, etc. But her novel was based on secondhand stories. And one of those features I was just mentioning earlier about these slave narratives is that they often had to testify. I swear this is true. I swear this is true. Even though I'm writing it down and he's telling me. I had a lot of other people here who asked him questions and his story was the same. Or I wrote it myself and this is true. I swear I wrote it myself and everyone agrees with me. All these attestations of truth and validity and whatever, with the hope of being more persuasive that way. The book that ends up being the most persuasive is fiction, although based on lots of true stories, but is nonetheless fiction. And so it is, again, one of the great ironies of American life, American culture, that even though the abolitionist movement is fiercely committed to truth and authenticity and verifiability and credibility, all the things that I talk about at the beginning of every one of these videos, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a fictional novel, gets more people off the fence towards the abolitionist cause than any other book that was published. America, what are you going to do? So I'm going to close it right here. I think next week I'll talk about this first wave abolition movement because it's kind of cool and unknown and also local. So if anyone has any questions for me about this literature, please feel free to ask. I'll show you two wonderful books that contain slave narratives if you're not going to go to the South. So this is The Classic Slave Narratives edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. It's one of his old books back when he was a youngin', before he had PBS shows. So we got The Life of Lotto Equiano, The History of Mary Prince, who was in the West Indies, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And my glorious Norton Anthology of African American Literature. This is the first edition. I was very lucky to get the first edition with a pile of editors. Henry Louis Gates Jr., Nellie McKay, I don't know who Andrews Christian Foster McDowell, Amelia Rampersand, Spillers and Yarborough are, but you see a whole lot of people involved in this. And this book is just, it's wonderful. But of course it's an anthology, so it has very few complete texts. But definitely worth getting. There's a new edition that just came out. Like I said, this is the original. It has a great CD. It talks about spirituals and lots of other stuff. This is one of the books I turn to when I'm teaching classes to kind of refresh information, memories, and facts so that I can teach them more effectively. And I will provide, again, the link. I'm going to go see if I can pull it up again. The Documenting the American South, so that you can just access these stories or these novels that are out of copyright, North American slave narratives. Is it not working again? docsouth.unc.edu. I'll just type it in. Like I said, it hasn't been, the site's down. But it's a wonderful resource. They also have the, sadly, they also have the apologetics, those novels that try to justify Southern culture, which were all novels. All right? So, okay. And yes, Cassandra, you're right. Actually, interestingly enough, Cassandra, when you're talking about these narratives, the ones that were written, like Douglas's narrative, he did benefit. He did receive the proceeds of them. Oh, or do you mean slavery? But the slave narrative authors did actually get paid. And in fact, one thing about the abolitionist movement, William Lloyd Garrison, who kind of is one of the spearhead, he's white. He was very radical. He was a radical pacifist, but he was very radical, and he insisted that all of his speakers, white and black, be paid for their work and for their efforts. Because he said, you know, you have to set the example for what equality means by forming a movement built on equality. Does that mean the abolitionist movement was perfect? Of course not. But there definitely were aspirations within that movement for black-white cooperation and to maintain equality across ethnic differences, regional divides, everything. There's a lot to be learned for how to build a multi-racial, multi-ethnic movement from the abolitionist movement. And also lessons to be learned from where they split and disagreed. Okay, I'll wait another minute for any more questions, just in case anyone else has ideas to share. Yeah, they got paid. Douglas made good money. Yeah, yeah. Douglas was a successful author. He lived a very comfortable middle class life on the basis of the fees he got paid for being a renowned speaker, and for the royalties from his novel, or from his autobiography. Sorry, not a novel. And he published his own newspaper, which he also got paid for, the North Star. And then he even published a second autobiography, which covered the post-war period and kind of Reconstruction and continuing developments. What hurt Douglas is he invested in the Reconstruction Bank, which was mismanaged and went bankrupt, so he lost a lot of money there. Yeah. Yeah, it's so easy just to think that people do terrible things, Cassandra, but people did do good things. And there were people who were able to make good lives and good livings through their work, which again had to serve as a model. Alrighty, I'm going to call it an afternoon. Thank you again for tuning in. I hope you learned some interesting new things. Check out those two books, or check out these narratives. They are excellent. Frederick Douglass's, of course, is just a masterpiece of literature in the general sense, and so is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The other works are very good as well. William Wells Brown was an excellent author. So was the Alaudo Equiano. Well, the Alaudo Equiano, by contemporary standards, is simple because we have advanced as people. In its time period, it was the peak of British sophisticated literature. But if you've read British literature of the 1790s, you'll see what I mean. All right? Have a wonderful day, everybody. Keep reading, keep learning, keep studying, and I'll see you here next week to talk about the 1730s. Have a great day. Bye. Gonna drink some water while it ends.